Hi, Loyd. It's nice to see you here today. Thanks for swinging by for an interview.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
You're-
So I'm here with Loyd Auerbach. He is faculty here at Atlantic University, and he's going to talk to us today a bit about parapsychology and the class you teach here. So maybe we'll just jump right in and tell us a bit about your work. What is parapsychology and what you do?
So parapsychology is the study of psychic experiences, psychic phenomena, abilities, and that runs the gamut from extrasensory perception, mind over matter type experiences, experiences and phenomena that relate to survival of bodily death, so life after death. And that would include, of course, all the what's called the paranormal on TV, what people commonly call that, even though the TV ghost hunters don't seem to draw a connection whatsoever. That's partly because they actually don't know the history and they're going from a particular perspective. So my background actually is a long-term interest in this subject since I was a kid because of science fiction and comic books and television more than anything else. And I was fortunate growing up to connect with parapsychologists in the New York area. Actually had a parapsychology club in high school and studied cultural anthropology in college, including supernatural and magical belief systems, which is related to how people interpret these things. And then I was lucky enough, timing-wise, to be able to get a master's degree from John F. Kennedy University during the time that the degree program was offered. The graduate program doesn't exist anymore.
You're right, it doesn't exist now, right?
Yeah, ever since the late 80s. So there are unfortunately no accredited parapsychology programs in the United States at this point. And my class at AU is one of the only accredited courses in the US at this point. So I ended up focusing on field work more than anything else and education. So I have three real main interests around parapsychology. Although I do participate from time to time in research, I mainly deal with field investigation and research, so outside the laboratory. Also applying what we learn in the lab to some of that work. And that's very different than what you see on TV for the ghost hunters. But I'm also very concerned with education and media, how the media presents these topics, and gets it wrong most of the time and goes to the sensationalist stuff. So I consider myself a generalist in parapsychology, but I have these different focal points, and I'm known as a ghostbuster. So
as the ghostbuster.
As a ghostbuster, yeah, with the field. But parallel to that, one of the things that came out of my graduate studies was learning about psychic fraud.
Yes. From
the perspective of a magician. And I just happened to really enjoy performing. So for the 80s, I was a magician, and starting in the 90s, I switched over to mentalism and psychic entertainment, so the more mind reading stuff, and have been very active in that specific small community since that time. So I still perform, although not right now during COVID time, but when I have a chance again, I'll be out performing again, often for organizations and occasionally for businesses and corporations, sometimes private parties. But I perform as Professor Paranormal.
Yes, that's right, Professor Paranormal.
Yeah, which is actually kind of carried over into the teaching as well to some extent, and certainly my writing. I've got 9 books out, about to release my first co-authored fiction novel with paranormal topics.
Very nice.
Coming out in October, called Near Death. And I unfortunately can't do much in terms of investigating right now during our times of COVID, but I do handle cases occasionally at a distance with people, and I'm working with colleagues on a couple of longer term cases with things as well. So teaching online courses, I'm very active with the Rhine Research Center. I'm on their vice president of the board of directors right now, president of an organization called the Forever Family Foundation, which is a nonprofit that works with spirit mediums in the family grieving process, but also supports education on the research that goes on as well.
That's awesome. So talk a little bit about, you alluded to it, kind of debunking this TV, I would not call it, paranormal, but that's not really where you're going with it. Talk a little bit about what you do and how that's just not real.
So, the TV folks, the TV shows, what they're called, the reality shows. Reality shows in general are really unscripted shows. And I think that people don't always make the distinction between a reality show and a documentary. And there's a whole history of where reality shows came from, has to do with budget, had to do with the Writers Guild strike in 1988. There's a number of things, and the rise of cable. So on those shows, the producers pretty much tell the investigators what to do. I mean, they'll let them run wild for a little bit, but most of those investigators, many of them don't have any training or education in parapsychology whatsoever. Some of them actually was at a conference 10 years ago with a couple of the guys from one of the main shows, and he made a statement that there was no literature before the 1990s, which indicated he had literally no idea of how long people have been doing investigations in this area. So what we see on TV is, first of all, it's collapse. And this is even pieces that I've done, where you can be at a place for many, many hours, and they'll pick and choose what they want to show. And that's the editors, folks. The other piece of it, though, is they've created their own folklore based on what television wants. So before night vision cameras came along for commercial use in the 80s, for example, I consistently worked with producers who wanted to turn the lights down low and make things look spooky. And even in a couple of instances wanted to turn the lights out, which was ridiculous. The camera guy actually talked him out of it.
Yeah, sure.
So, because we couldn't show anything. But with night vision, they can shoot in the dark, and that's spooky. And that has become the standard for these amateur and hobbyist ghost hunters, because that's what they see on TV. Not based on science, not based on history, not based on research. They also focus on technology, which does not detect the paranormal. In fact, there is nothing other than human beings and possibly animals that can detect the paranormal, psychic things. So there's a lot of people making a lot of money selling tech to ghost hunters and giving them really bad science to do.
It's
That's
theater.
one of the reasons why I encourage people to take parapsychology courses or read books.
Right. So let's segue into that. So now, you know, we're going to debunk theater essentially. Now talk about your course. What do we do in this your parapsychology course at the university?
This is the Principles of Parapsychology course is actually an overview of the field.
Sure.
And it looks at all aspects of what parapsychology covers, not just the experiences people have, because there is an experiential element to the course, but also looks at specifically the research that's been done, the findings that we have in the laboratory and outside the laboratory. So I do cover investigation techniques. I do cover the research and evidence for life after death. So really it's looking at what the evidence actually is for these experiences, for these phenomena, for these abilities from a scientific perspective, where the science is, how we've dealt with things in the laboratory, how we deal with things outside the laboratory, and where the overlap is, because you can't be terribly scientific in a kind of a spontaneous investigation. You can just put some science in place. But then you have to relate that back to what we know about this phenomena historically, and it's really about data crunching, data analysis that we've done to know the patterns, to know how this relates to things in the laboratory as well. So we're learning a lot of that. And then there's quite a bit about throughout the course, but mainly towards the end, about the implications of these abilities, of psychic phenomena. I mean, or just simply things, ideas like, what are the implications of consciousness surviving the death of the body? What are the implications of people picking up information without their normal senses? Where does that go? How do our thoughts get turned into action? There are serious implications there. So it really is kind of try to make it a well-rounded course covering all aspects.
And when you say normal senses, you mean everything that we know, taste, touch, smell.
Well, yeah, I mean, when we're talking about senses versus extrasensory, where the term extrasensory comes from is because it's heavy emphasis on the word perception. Because every bit of information that comes through our biological senses, the senses we've identified, and it's more than 5 actually, but when we take a look at those and get the data, we make sense of the data in our heads, basically. But then there's this additional information that comes in that's not coming through those normal senses, that gets integrated in our perceptions. So we're studying what is not sensory, what's not for sure coming through the senses, what's not being kind of pulled together by our intuition, which is really an unconscious process. What is additional beyond the range of what the senses can pick up. And then for things like psychokinesis or mind over matter, it's how can we affect things around us, including our own bodies, by the way. So it's even self-healing. The placebo effect itself is a good example of a form of mind-body connection, which is a form of psychokinesis. So we look at all those things.
So you mentioned consciousness. Tell me how parapsychology plays into the study of consciousness.
Well, in actuality, we're the only field studying the phenomena of consciousness directly without worrying about so much the brain. I mean, we do consider the brain in this process. But of course, the big debate in science is consciousness in the brain? Is it just the brain? Or is it more than the brain? Is it outside the brain, just filtering through the brain? There are questions that come up about that. And things like ESP and psychokinesis don't rely specifically on the brain, certainly don't rely on our normal senses or physical instrumentalities. Mm-hmm. So these are direct phenomena of consciousness, of mind, of spirit, of soul, whatever you want to call it. And then if we're talking about life after death, survival of consciousness, we are talking about the existence of our consciousness beyond the death of the body and brain in that sense. So really, we are studying phenomena and abilities and experiences of direct consciousness types, whether the brain's involved or not.
So what would you say to a student who's interested in taking the parapsychology course? What is it and what is it not?
It is not a course on ghost hunting.
Thank you.
It's not that. It is not what you see on the paranormal TV shows. It is a course that has science as the base. So there is starting out a little bit on the scientific method because it's important for people to understand. And it's a course that's rooted in over 130 years, almost 140 years now, of research in these phenomena, which do include extrasensory perception. You know, that's telepathy, that's clairvoyance, remote viewing, precognition, psychokinesis, which includes healing, psychic healing, energy healing, all of that is part of this. And then the phenomena of survival of bodily death, which is not just ghostly stuff. That includes working with mediums. It includes the evidence coming from near-death experiences. And certainly when we're talking about the idea of consciousness surviving, there's a question of reincarnation as well. And the evidence, and the type of evidence we consider good evidence versus not so good evidence, or even bad evidence. The weight of evidence is one of the things that the course definitely covers. So students hopefully come out with an understanding of why parapsychologists do what we do in the laboratory, why we don't accept certain things as evidence, which unfortunately a lot of people do, and where the skeptics have gotten things wrong, because there's a lot of bad information out there from the skeptical community who rarely ever even looks at our research, and in fact will often say that, why would I look at the research? It's not worth looking at. That's actually bad science. And any scientist who makes a pronouncement about this phenomena, these abilities or experiences without actually looking at the evidence, looking at the research, is not doing good science.
Why, if you're going to have theater, why look at the science behind it?
Right. Well, the reality is that a lot of what the skeptic community does is theater. It's purely for effect. It's to get an emotional reaction.
Of course. Well, it's scary. People want that jump scare, that thriller, intense, which I prefer not to have, but I do understand why people watch it. So it was nice to have you with me today, Loyd. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add links to Loyd's website and to his bio in the comments section below, in our information section below. And I'll also link to your bio page, which I know also links to your personal web page and a number of other links. So if anybody wants to get in touch with Professor Paranormal, they'll know how to do so. So I really thank you for spending time with me. And if anyone needs to get in touch with you, it's pretty easy. They'll just find it on our webpage. Yeah, and actually, if they Google me, I am the only Loyd Auerbach, so it's not hard to find me at all. That's pretty good. I think I'm the only Rachel Vincitore, too. So that's nice. It's maybe a blessing and a curse at the same time. Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. All right. Thanks, Loyd. I appreciate you having you here today. Thanks, Rachel. Bye.